Hey everyone, welcome to a Story Trading Weekly Meetup. We got a nice presentation for you, an update on VIP Pick VTSI from Kevin Crawford. Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
Awesome, great. So before we get started, I got a few housekeeping notes to take care of. First, a quick disclaimer. Story Trading is not an investment advisor, and that goes for our guests unless stated otherwise. And investing in securities involves significant risk of loss. By now, you should all know what Story Trading is. If you don't, head over to Story Trading and learn more about us. You can there track our VIP picks and see upcoming events we got going on. Before we get into VTSI, I've had a lot of people ask me to be a little bit more transparent about my personal portfolio and how I'm thinking of things. So I just want to give a little bit of commentary on the market, which I just did on Twitter Spaces. So, you know, we did warn, I personally warned of volatility coming December and January, particularly the growth stocks and ARKK. So I think a lot of us knew that was coming, but even though we knew that was coming, it's very hard to execute. The chop, right? That chop usually comes before the drop. That chop market, one of the most difficult to do emotionally, to buy low, sell high, very, very difficult. So execution is very hard. I will say that I'm seeing chart patterns and valuations similar to 1999. I've been trading for 25 plus years. So I've been through all kinds of bear markets. And I would just advise caution. Things can still go down much lower, particularly growth stocks. The valuations are still very high among growth stocks. And you could go into a correction or a bear market that lasts a couple quarters, maybe even more. This is all possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen. That could bring down the NASDAQ and the Dow and eventually can even hit cheaply valued value stocks, which we know we're seeing a rotation into value stocks, but in a big market correction or bear market, even value stocks can get hit. So a couple words of advice: avoid margin. I always say that. Avoid margin and call options. You want to, not get washed out. You want to consider hedges. So I'm actually looking to add to hedges on relief rallies or dead cat bounces in the big indices. I think there's a possibility we get a bunch of 15 to 25% moves. Even if we are going to be in a more extended bear market, you often see these 15 to 25% moves. And personally, I may be adding to hedges, SARK, which is shorting ARK, RWM, shorting IWM, the Russell, and PSQ, which shorts NASDAQ. And there's plenty of others out there you may want to consider. So listen, the name of the game when you have a bear market is capital preservation. Stay in the game. If you want to retire on stocks, you got to play the long game and you got to make sure you keep capital in there so you have enough money to experiment and learn your lessons. So those are my little feedback on the market. Now, despite that, I love stock picking. Story Trading loves stock picking, and I still think we can find the diamonds in the rough. If you look at the past bunch of VIP picks we've had here, there's been a number of winners, a few losers too, but I think the winners have outshined them. And even in the January trade ideas, there's been a couple huge winners. SEAC up over 300% bottom to top, which a lot of people got right. PTE up 55%, and it may have more room to go. So that's my market commentary. And with that, we're going to go into VTSI, which has been a long time VIP pick. It's up 64% to date since the CEO presented, but it's been down 46% since the peak. And that's why we're here to continue doing the due diligence and find out if VTSI is a buy or if it's a hold or if it's in danger, because it's starting to go down. There's lots of interesting catalysts coming up, and Kevin Crawford is the pro on that. For you guys who don't remember, it's a VTSI is a police and military training company. Here's the chart. You can see it's done very well, and there's what I'm talking about. So overview, big picture. I'm going to set up Kevin a little bit. There was excitement and anticipation over a potential large military contract, which the government had delayed, and I think that marked the top. And now recently, we've seen a little bit of a bounce, potentially because of that Canadian contract, which Kevin found. So let's get into the meat and potatoes. We're going to be looking at, the 4 pillars over at Story Trading, learning about fundamentals and catalysts primarily from Kevin, but then putting that puzzle all together with sentiment and technicals to help us time our entries and exits. So with that, Kevin, take it from here, man. Thank you for joining us. You've been a pro on this stuff.
Right, happy to talk about this. For me personally, it's my largest position, but obviously everyone do your own due diligence, and you can hold as much as you want. But for me, I think the company has kind of, as you talked about, there's a big push for the U.S. Army IVAS program to launch at the end of last year. It was obviously delayed, and that hit the stock, as I imagine there's a lot of people who were in it for that, as the Army was kind of pumping and saying that was going to launch in September, and there were no signs that it wasn't. But from everything I'm seeing so far, things are looking good for 2022, although like obviously caveats, we have no idea. But there's a lot of things going on for the company that I figured it was worth giving an update. So for folks not familiar with VirTra, they are, it's been said, a police training company. They have simulators from anywhere from 1 to 5 screens, or projector screens, basically fill up an entire room. You can use real live weapons with they call them drop-in recoil kits that are essentially an accessory that you place into the weapon, and it turns it into a simulator or a simulated weapon. Doesn't shoot live rounds, shoots a laser, and that interacts with the simulator. VirTra has, it's important to note that VirTra has patents on these recoil kits, as well as similar accessories for tasers and OC spray, which all adds to the realism in the training experience. Other things about the company, I guess, kind of how I think about VirTra is they sell to 4 different segments. They sell to the military, they sell to the US law enforcement, they sell internationally, and they sell to the US federal government. From the law enforcement side, VirTra is known to be the gold standard for police training. Like I said, their intellectual property makes them gives them the most realistic weapons and accessories. And their simulators have the most realistic content. Shot in 4K. It doesn't look like a video game. It's recorded with real actors, all that kind of thing. And their competition either has similar shot with real actor stuff, but in worse quality, essentially. And some of their other competitors essentially use video game like graphics. And the company goes out of its way to kind of tell investors that these video game like graphics cause for lesser, or essentially worse, training experience, as there's nuance in seeing a real person and trying to read the situation to get the best training, essentially, rather than playing a video game. So I bring that up because that is a selling point. That is like the base selling point for the law enforcement side, is VirTra is the cream of the crop. They're the best company for law enforcement to purchase from. So as I talk about all these other things later on, it's nice to fall back on VirTra is in a growing segment of law enforcement who has where the market for that is growing after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all that stuff. There's money flowing into this market. And that kind of puts I kind of think of it as it puts a base or a floor underneath the stock price, and I guess the company as well. So I'll talk about some of the other, I guess I'll pause and see if anyone has questions. Can you bring up in chat, or if there's other ways, Ben?
Yeah, no, that's good background. Really interested in hearing about recent catalysts, which I know you're going to get to, and upcoming catalysts, and then also how you think about valuation, particularly because there's like a rotation from growth or excitement, sentiment, whatever you want to think about it. You know, we had that big run up because of the excitement of that military contract. So now the market may be rotating into value plays, and VTSI is also one of my top picks because just looking at the earnings or the PE, it seems like it could be a little safer. So very excited to kind of hear your view on the valuation as well.
Yeah. Let's talk about catalysts and then we'll get to valuation, because I think understanding the catalyst kind of makes, in my opinion, the valuation less important, because the catalysts that are in front of them, near term and longer term, can grow the company so much. But I'll definitely bring it up later on.
Yep, sounds great. Thanks.
So getting back to those 4 different markets, I talked about US law enforcement. There's a couple, let's start with it. Let's go with international, I guess. So recently VirTra, I think it was like mid-December, VirTra won a standing offer with the Canadian government to provide training simulators to many different agencies throughout the country. They have something called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Part of this RFP was also the Canadian Coast Guard, the Border Service, Correctional Services, all these, there are like 10 different agencies. VirTra should be the program of record moving forward to providing training simulators for all of them. Within that standing offer, a standing offer is essentially, I don't know a good way to say it. It's a commitment to give VirTra these sole source capability to provide for all these agencies, but it's not a contract. The Canadian government hasn't said, we'll take 1,000 simulators or 10 simulators. They've just said, when we purchase simulators, we will buy from VirTra. So it's kind of a safe assumption that, assuming Canada does move forward with purchasing simulators, it'll go through VirTra. And so getting back to the tender itself, or the RFP, Canada basically said that, hey, we have hundreds of agencies throughout the country, hundreds of locations. They need simulators at all of them in some way or another. So they're stationary simulators. There's a 300 degree that needs, and that's like difficult to take up and put down. And then there's like single screen simulators that are more easier to move around, pack up, move to a different agency or different location. And the reason those are beneficial is because, like I said, Canada's a big place. And in that RFP, they said they want these portable simulators that can be packed up, put in a car, and driven across the country to a different location. And in that RFP, they were saying that they would like about 100 stationary simulators and hundreds of portable simulators. And when you start doing the math of that, you're looking at somewhere, additionally, outside of the simulators, they obviously need the recoil kits. They need content, custom scenarios that requires additional software that VirTra sells, and all this other stuff. So when you start doing the math on that, you're looking at an order size, assuming that they purchase these hundreds of simulators of like 20, 30, 40 million, possibly. The contract was, or the offer was a term of 3 years with two additional 1-year options. So 3 to 5 years, essentially, that we could potentially see if they fulfill everything is for, let's say, $30-40 million over 5 years. So you're looking at $10 million a year, roughly. Maybe it's lumpy, maybe it's not. $10 million in year 1, maybe it's 5 million in year 1 and 10 million in year 2, 15 in year 3, that sort of thing. But essentially, it's a big opportunity that VirTra is going to get in some way or another. And I'll pause there, see if anyone has questions, thoughts.
I'm good. If you guys have questions throughout, you can throw it in chat or raise your hand. But yeah, let's keep going.
I'll keep going. So that's one international opportunity. Another one is in the UK. And essentially the theme here on a lot of stuff is virtual reality, as I'm sure people are aware, is becoming more of a product or tooling that can happen now rather than in 3 to 5 years in the future. So you'll see a lot of these countries or these militaries starting to adopt these virtual reality training or headsets, systems that VirTra integrates with. So in the UK, there's something called R-Test, which is essentially a way for people, it's like essentially laser tag training. People wear a vest. There's receptors on or receivers on the vest that you can shoot a weapon. The receivers are triggered if you get shot. And it's a way to basically run live on or force on force simulations with real people. So in the UK, they're looking to have, upgrade their laser tag systems, our test systems. But typically these things are used with blank ammunition. The UK wants to use roundless technology, so something like things that shoot lasers, or something that shoots lasers and is realistic, like a VirTra recoil kit that has kickback. You can jam the weapons jam, all that sort of thing. And without blank ammunition, you're able to run these training scenarios in a lot more locations than you could otherwise. Obviously, you can't go into like a school or movie theater or government building and start shooting blank rounds, but you can shoot lasers. So it essentially extends where you can do training. And the UK is looking to purchase equipment over a 5 to 10 year contract that's going to be somewhere between 100 or 10 to $100 million value. That program requires essentially drop-in recoil kits. They've called out the vests, essentially the laser receptors, and then also like after action reviews, so they can replay and talk about it after the fact. VirTra obviously supplies recoil kits, and they also do after action reviews, so they're a good. Their capabilities are a good match for this UK RTES opportunity. Again, the opportunity was somewhere between $10 to $100 million over the 5 to 10 year time frame, assuming things work out, assuming it goes VirTra's way. In the US, VirTra is clearly the leader in this space. Like I said, they have IP on this drop-in recoil kit. No one else has it. So when you start seeing opportunities where these requirements are there, where you need realistic weapons, VirTra is really the only place companies can go, or countries or militaries can go to get this kind of stuff. Then the other part of international, on the smaller side, but things that have already happened that there's not risk, is VirTra won 2 orders over in Q3, towards the end of Q3, one from a country in the Middle East, a new country in the Middle East, and the other is a small police agency that's in northern Spain. Both of those orders were for like $1.3 million. For people who aren't familiar with the company, they do about $20 million in revenue a year. So those are pretty big orders for them. And the interesting thing about the Spanish order is that when the RFP went out, there were many people who responded. There were demos requested. And when people went to give demos, they couldn't provide the capabilities that they said they had. And so the Spanish agency went back and said, hey, if you can't do this, don't submit a bid. If you can't provide the capability you said, you're going to have to demo it, and don't submit a bid this time. And it turns out VirTra was the only one who could supply the capabilities that were required. And in my mind, this kind of reinforces my belief that VirTra is the only company that can provide the capabilities that a lot of these countries or militaries are providing, which again just kind of reinforces that any opportunities that are coming up for new training are very likely to go to VirTra. That's the international side of things. So we'll move to military here. I brought up IBIS earlier. It's essentially a headset by the US Army. There's a big 5 to 10 year contract value associated with that. $22 billion are given to Microsoft over that time. Supposed to roll out last year, got delayed, pushed back 12 months, and they'll be testing throughout the next 6 months. I think sometime in May, they're supposed to do user testing, and assuming that goes well, it's supposed to roll out in September. There were a couple conferences in December or November maybe that gave updates on IBIS and the training program that VirTra is that I think VirTra is a part of, or will be a part of. Both programs essentially talked about the parts of the IBIS program that were delayed, like the field of vision. Thanks for pulling that up, Ben. Yeah, the field of vision on goggles was only like 40 degrees. They're working on getting it to 70. They think they're making progress. Some other stuff's happening, but they basically said that they're making progress on SIVT or on the IVIS program and some of the training tools used. When initially it was delayed, I kind of was like, well, you don't see VR headsets or AR headsets being used right now anywhere. So maybe all the government talk of, hey, we're going to launch in 2022, maybe it was premature, maybe they'll need to delay it further. But what they're saying so far kind of gives me hope that maybe it's not going to be delayed any longer than this year. And like I've talked about before, I posted on Seeking Alpha blog. I've posted on StoryTrading. I think I've done other talks. And if you want more information, you can go rewatch those. But the opportunity is going to be like $15-20 million a year for VirTra alone, in my estimation. So again, we're talking about a $20 million revenue company. The IVIS program being that size, similar to the Canada opportunity almost. There's a lot of stuff going on. The other US military opportunity is a program called the Soldier Virtual Trainer. It's SVT for short. You can go on some government websites, see the RFI that was requested or that was put out, what the requirements are, all that sort of thing. But essentially, they call out the specific need for drop-in recoil kits, realistic. They have weapon malfunctions. You can track ammo. All that's it requires being in a real weapon. All that sort of thing. So you see this stuff, and VirTra has the IP to do this. So you have to assume VirTra is going to be involved in some way. But they also require some sort of headset. They didn't explicitly call it out, but some of the presentations they've given have talked about headsets. So I'll take a step back and say the RFI says, like, this is what we want. You tell us what the best solution is from a bid perspective. And so the government won't tell you we need headsets, but that's really the direction they're going. So VirTra has, I bring that up because VirTra recently filed trademarks for a trademark on the phrase BXR, which is mixed reality. And they specifically called out this patent, or this trademark is meant for headsets. VirTra CEO has also been talking about headsets not being a current product, but there's things that they're working on behind the scenes that aren't yet announced, and they'll talk about when they can. I'm kind of reading between the lines there. My take is that VirTra is working on headsets, and their bid for the SVT award included these headsets. And once this bid kind of comes out and someone is awarded the deal, we'll see VirTra roll out headsets as a new product offering, probably to local police or law enforcement, maybe not, because their current simulators already work and are realistic, but to other militaries maybe. But at least for this SVT, I think they're going to be submitting a bid with headsets. As far as opportunity size, from what I've seen at conferences called TSIS, there was basically said this SVT program is going to be a 4-year program that's the funding is going to be $63 million over the 4 years to build a prototype. So again, it's probably not realistic to assume it's going to be linear, that they'll get $15 million a year, but over the course of 4 years, it averages out to $15 million, assuming VirTra wins it. The other thing to note here is that I talked to the CEO a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that for government bids, VirTra is able to partner with anyone or many companies who submit bids. So if you think that the requirement is that they use drop-in recoil kits, VirTra can actually go to all of these bidders that they think are going to bid, or whoever the other prime contractors are, and say, hey, I can give you my recoil kits as part of your bid. So maybe you think that no matter who wins, it makes sense that they'll use VirTra's recoil kits. I don't know how likely that is. It seems kind of counterintuitive that VirTra would compete against their own headsets by giving competition their recoil kits, but it's always possible. And I imagine the CEO is very, the CEO says things for certain for a reason on some of these calls. I think he's very explicit about what he says and why he says it. And I imagine that would be why he brought it up. So those two military opportunities, again, are somewhere in 10 to 20 million, 15 million a year range for long term. So we talked to the CEO on a previous call, Ben and I and others, and he talked about the company kind of moving towards a direction where they could potentially be doing $100 million a year in revenue with the military. And this all kind of points to large deals being in the pipeline. And obviously IBIS and SVT, the SVT program, are two opportunities with the US military that are coming up real quick. The SVT program, IBIS, we already know, I said, was September 2022 that's supposed to be rolled out, assuming all goes well. SVT award is supposed to happen in May, assuming demos and COVID and all that stuff doesn't slow things down. But in theory, we should be finding out about it sooner rather than later. The last kind of, go ahead, Ben.
No, it's a lot of things cooking. That's awesome. As you're doing, I can't wait to show this to you, but you're going through these catalysts and a lot of possible, events that could really accelerate revenue. So as soon as you're done with the catalysts, I'm going to show you guys some fundamental charts. It's going to be real interesting. So let's finish up on the catalysts. Yeah.
So the last catalyst is in 2021, there was a $24.5 million IDIQ, which is kind of similar to the Canadian standing offer that says, if we're going to buy simulators, we'll buy them from VirTra. And this IDIQ is with Department of Homeland Security and the Customs and Border Protection. This was a 5-year, $24.5 million IDIQ. It originated last year. There was also $1.4 million order in August. But I bring this up because in September, October, something like that, the Department of Homeland Security put together a task force to standardize the training across all of their children agencies. So the DHS coordinates, or the DHS basically runs Customs and Borders Protection. They run FLETC, which is the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which VirTra already supplies training simulators to. They won that contract a couple of years ago. Another department is Secret Service. VirTra are also the supplier of training services to the Secret Service. Another sub-agency of DHS is Coast Guard. But this task force is essentially trying to standardize training for all of these agencies, where VirTra is already the incumbent supplier. So it kind of makes sense that, assuming DHS standardized training, and they also said they're going to partner with every level of government, this task force, and basically say, this is the training we're doing, all the other agencies should do similar. And if VirTra is already supplying to all of these 8 subcomponents of DHS, then it makes sense that they'll continue to leverage these tools and kind of pitch these to other agencies. So whatever agencies aren't using VirTra simulators, and a lot of them already are, you kind of think that they're going to have a lot more success going forward. But I will say that in 2019, the downside of the federal agency stuff is 2018 through 2020, VirTra won about $9 million in orders from US federal agencies. There's a website that kind of shows all this, but oddly enough, in 2021, there was only $4.5 million of orders placed from the federal government. I don't know why. It seems like they're getting traction from FLETC. There was a $1.5 million order. Obviously, this $24.5 million IDIQ is good for them, but there was that kind of drop in 2021 for whatever reason. So you'd hope there's catalyst, but there's kind of a counter trend, at least for 2021 for whatever reason. But yeah, those are essentially the catalysts. I throw out these numbers. I see all these numbers. I talked about IBIS being 20 million. I talked about our test being up 10 to 100 million over a lifetime. SVT being $60 million, and that's just for the prototype phase. Like I said, like I keep saying, VirTra is a $20 million revenue company. Their market cap is $70 million, and they have $20 million cash. So all these catalysts have opportunity to significantly change the company. I'll kind of leave it at that, Ben.
Yeah, that's great. And let me now kind of transition the conversation. You just mentioned some of that, and I'm going to show you this visually. There's the revenue you're talking about, 20 million, and this is over 5 years. You can see it's pretty much a straight line up, except for this drop here. I don't know if that was COVID or what.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So, and then take a look at this. It's also dropping down to the bottom line on the EPS, 46 cents there, and this is 12 months trailing. So that's a high here in the last 5 years.
I will jump in and say EPS there was like a $1.3 million. I think it was like 13 cents for the PPP loan forgiveness. So this is kind of inflated a bit, but
got it. So maybe operating income would be a little bit better. But look at the PE ratio, and maybe inflated as well. This is forward. I guess there must be at least one analyst covering this, because Y Charts gets they only get this data if there's analyst coverage. But you can see how that PE ratio has been dropping over time, and now it's at a 17 forward PE, which and that's one of the things that really excites me, is that you have all of these catalysts plus this low PE in a market that's getting, frothy for growth stocks and maybe looking for a home in value stocks. And I want to get your opinion on this, Kevin. Look at the cash position. We know they did a big raise this past year, $21 million in cash now. I wonder if all of these things that are cooking now for them, and the trademarks coming out, and all this new business they may be bidding on, is being made possible by this cash, this war chest they have. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so circling back to the PE real fast, I think four or three analysts, I think they are covering VirTra, are projecting like, I think 25. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's a low number, like 25 or $27 million in revenue next year. EPS maybe 30 cents, maybe 27 cents. I don't remember again, but they're a lot lower than if any of these deals go through. And in my mind, there's a high probability that some of these deals happen. Some of this revenue starts flowing in. So I think these analyst numbers are quite low.
There you go. There's the estimates right there. You can see that the blended estimate is 39 cents for next fiscal year.
But talking about the cash position, I think what Bob said initially was, in May when they raised cash, it was basically to give the federal government, in my mind, or it was basically to give them more leverage and more confidence that they could withstand growth. So if you think about them being part of the IBIS program, they need to supply $10 million worth of equipment a year for the next 5 to 10 years. If they're sitting on $2 or $3, $4 million cash, it's going to be hard for the government to say, oh yeah, you can build $10 million of equipment for us, sell it for 20 million, something like that. If they only have 3 million cash, you're going to need some kind of funding. So my take is VirTra raised money to have that balance sheet to say, hey, look, I have the cash, I can do this. Anything goes wrong, I still have extra cash. That sort of thing. And then obviously, if you think of all these other deals coming in, they might need to spend money on money elsewhere as well. So this kind of gives them that cushion. So that's kind of my take on why they raised cash. Company didn't really give much direction, but they said it would help growth in the future. And I think they also purchased a warehouse factory for $10 million, maybe put $2 million down. And again, if you're sitting on $4 million cash and you're expecting growth, you need to buy a factory. You can't do that sitting on that little of cash.
Great. That sounds good. So I'm gonna just want to get some opinions on the price action here and looking forward. You're saying this is your biggest position. Trying to pull up a chart over here. So all in all, put it all together, and what's your thinking in terms of what the opportunity is here with share price performance? If you don't mind sharing some opinions on that.
Is that forward-looking or recent share price?
Yeah, I mean, but if you want to comment on what's happened recently, but also, since you mentioned this is your largest position, what are you kind of hoping to get out of this in the next couple?
That makes sense. Yeah, so Ben kind of alluded to this, but that drop from 12 down was basically the day that news was released of the IVIS program. And then I don't really know what happened the rest of the time. Probably people finding out of the news, thinking, planning, I don't know. But looking forward, I kind of think all of these, well, I'll start with this. Like I said at the beginning of the call, I think the law enforcement business is growing. Previously, historically, law enforcement and federal, they basically weren't doing military, was enough to withstand, or enough to provide $20 million revenues. We know that industry is growing. We know the federal government, or we know there's a $24.5 million IDIQ. I think that $20 million should be easy to generate moving forward and kind of give that floor. The other thing I was going to say on that is that they have a backlog, I think, of like $23 million. So you kind of think that eventually that will start flowing through. I've kind of done some homework and figured out what most of that is, in my opinion, my estimation. So I think there's a good chance that we'll see growth in revenue, even if none of these catalysts I talked about land. So I'm willing to say there's a low floor or a high floor on the stock from a performance perspective, and obviously you'd hope that translates to price. But if any of these deals work out, I think the company, so I'll take a step back and say the company hasn't grown historically. They grow 10% a year or something like that. So we don't really know operating leverage, but from talking to the company, they basically have told us that they'll hire if they need, but for the most part, they won't need additional headcount, significant headcount, or any other things to grow, or OpEx to grow. So they've grown headcount already from, I think, 100 at the end of 2020 to 118 at the end of 2021. So if you kind of believe the company that they'll be able to scale business without significant OpEx, I'm thinking that we'll probably get 30, like with $30 million revenue, we'll get roughly 50-cent EPS in 2022. And that $30 million from those catalysts I talked about being $10-20 million a year, I think should be realistically relatively easy to hit. And then if things go really well, maybe IVIS rolls out, and you get some revenue from that. SVT revenue flows in relatively early. Canada orders $5-10 million, something like that. 40 million seems reasonable as well. Revenue, not out of the question at that point. I'm expecting something like 70 cents EPS. And if somehow we get to $50 million revenue, which I kind of think is more likely in 2023 that we get on that run rate, you're looking at $1 EPS roughly. And I think when we first started looking at VTSI, we talked to the CEO with Mark Gomes. And I think during one of those conversations, CEO said that I think Mark phrased it where the CEO essentially confirmed that if they get to $50 million in revenue, they'll essentially do $1.50 EPS. I think that was before the raise, which essentially diluted them 40%. So you kind of put that as $1 at $1 EPS for $50 million revenue. So those are kind of my expectations of operating leverage and where we could see numbers come in. And obviously you start throwing multiples on, and at a stock price of $6, it just kind of seems like no brainer to me.
Yeah, it seems like limited downside with a lot of optionality if any of these things come through that are cooking in for them.
Yeah, it's option. We say optionality because obviously there's no guarantee, but in my mind, they have the IP to be the only provider of a lot of this stuff. So
great.
Yeah, that's my perspective.
Nice. Sounds like a great stock to maybe sit on and see how things play out. It's a rough market. I'll anything else you wanted to add, Kevin?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Right. So let me kind of summarize from the 4-pillar perspective. So, we just went through the fundamentals, which looks like has a pretty good floor fundamentally. I'd advise though, and we'll get to it into the sentiment section a little bit, but the macro environment is such that if you do get a drawdown in overall indices, nothing's safe. That's been my experience. Again, I've been trading for 25, almost 30 years. And when you go through these big market corrections and bear cycles, the value companies are the last ones to drop, but they also drop. That's just a fact of life. There's fear, liquidation, things that happen. So, you got to know the story. You got to know what you're holding and be willing to go through some of that volatility if you're a longer term investor. So that's the fundamentals. You talked about all the incredible catalysts coming up. On the sentiment, I'm going to add my view on sentiment. Again, there's a macro concern over quote unquote risk assets, which I think that has part to do with why this was coming down, because I think Wall Street groups in basically any micro cap company, as a risk asset. And that's why you see it dipping below the 20, 50, 200 DMAs and kind of moving with RKK a little bit. But obviously, the percentage movements down are not going to be as huge as what you see with the overvalued growth companies. From a value perspective, there's multiple contraction in terms of the PE ratio. So that's something to be aware of. On the plus side, you have the rotation into value stocks. So that's all the sentiment. You got to put it all together and, combine it with fundamentals, catalysts, and technicals. To
Ben,
basically,
could I jump in on the sentiment? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt your pitch.
Yeah.
Or your flow, I should say.
Go ahead.
From a sentiment perspective, I also think there's a negative perspective on that IBIS deal. I've talked to some people who have started researching VirTra, and it's like IBIS was delayed. We can't. It's not really fair to bake it in. In my perspective, from my perspective, it's quite certain the U.S. military or the U.S. Army continues to invest in this, whether it's 2023 or 2025, who knows? But I don't think this is a dead on arrival kind of program like some of the other ones historically are. The tech is essential. It's close enough where they should get there eventually. And the other thing I'll add is a lot of these catalysts, I've talked to other people, no one really knows about them. You can Google it, and if you are familiar with the industry, it makes sense. But for a company with analysts who weren't really aware even of the IBIS deal, I'm sure they weren't aware of the Canada deal a while back. They're not aware of SVT, maybe UKR test program. I don't think they're aware of that, and whatever else might exist that I'm not aware of.
Nice.
So from a sentiment perspective, all they have is IBIS, and you look at the chart or you look at revenues, it doesn't seem like it's growing. So I would say it's kind of probably bearish there to an extent.
Yeah, I'm glad he added that with this company specific sentiment. My comments here were all macro, but yeah, if you go look at that chart, you'll see that, how that stock crashed when IBIS was delayed. And you're right, there could be a perception that that's all they had cooking in terms of optionality to the upside. But, that's where you can get violent movements to the upside when they get some other contract, which isn't IBIS, and everyone's blindsided. They're like, oh, we thought there was only IBIS. So that's a great kind of perspective to have there. All right. So, Kevin, thank you very much for that. I don't see any other questions. Oh, wait, maybe we do. Here we go. We got a question from Bart. Bart Watson, how large is the technology moat giving VirTra its lead? Isn't it likely that another company will invest in this attractive market and leapfrog ahead?
Yep. So there's two parts of the business. There's simulators and there's recoil kits. From a simulation technology, their content is really their moat. It takes money and time to build this content. I think VirTra also is they have a capability to basically take a green screen and actors and put that into their content. So you can basically say a customer can go to I think somewhere in France, they wanted to go to a train station, basically film the train station and then put actors and whatnot that were recorded somewhere else into that train station and use the train station as a backdrop, essentially like probably what they do with movies. VirTra is one of the few companies that has that. I imagine that's not relative or very straightforward to do. So there's that. And then but that's essentially their moat for simulation. Their real moat, though, is their recoil kits. They have patents on mechanically induced weapon jamming. So if you think of like duck hunt, the gun is basically just pull the trigger as much as you want. Some of the other companies that provide weapons for training simulation are essentially that. There's no kickback, there's no reloading, there's no ammo, or there's no malfunctions. And in some of these RFPs or documentation, they specifically call out that functionality. And in my opinion, it's because VirTra has that functionality. And when the market knows that it's there, they don't want anything less. There's no reason to train with weapons that aren't real when the capability is there for a couple $1,000s extra. That patent, I think, they have that patent on all weapons. We've talked to the CEO. He said that is pretty well protected. They don't see a ton of threat there. So from a recoil kit perspective and content, I think their moat is pretty big. Some of their competition in Barris has kind of moved away from simulation training and has started to get into live training. Some of their other competition just hasn't done anything. They basically say we're a low-cost simulator similar to VirTra. And other competition is going into headsets, but again, they have worse weapons. So maybe competition will say, hey, this headset is the new shiny new thing and it's video game graphics, and VirTra's like, hey, our content is way better. VirTra's obviously also working on headsets, in my opinion. So I think their mode is good enough, at least for the next couple of years. I don't really understand how the recoil kit market will change. From the patents, those I think expire in 2032, somewhere along those lines. It's quite a while from now.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That was the other question from chat. You know when the patents expire. That's awesome. All right. So thank you, Kevin, so much for that presentation. That was awesome. Really appreciate you keeping up with the story. Sounds like an awesome kind of risk reward here with VTSI. If you want to continue collaborating on VTSI, you could do that in the VIP community in the VTSI research group. Kevin is there with a lot of other people collaborating on this name. Man, we got lots of events coming up. We have at least 2 CEO presentations this week, one from MTP, one from INVE, Identiv. So guys, if you're a VIP, stay tuned. We're going to do Trade of the Week in just a second. For the rest of you, please follow us on YouTube and on Twitter. Is there one more question here? Sanjay says, awesome update. Thank you very much, Kevin. So with that, we're going to end our recording and move on to our Trade of the Week session. Thank you, everybody.